Good morning, everyone.
Good
I'm
morning.
Kathy Minahan, and I'm president of NACD New England. Thank you for joining us for our virtual program, highly interesting virtual program, Navigating Election Year Politics and the Role of the Board. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted throughout the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. No need to wait until the Q&A portion of the event to submit questions. We'll monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse the questions as they come up. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits for this program. To receive credit, we need to know your first and last name. Please make sure that your full name is visible on your Zoom window. If you're on this call via phone, send an email to Larissa Ravetto so that you can receive credit. Finally, the panelists and moderators' statements and opinions are their own and not the company's for whom they work. Larissa, how about putting up the slide for our wonderful sponsors? Aha, here they are. I would be remiss if I did not thank all of our chapter sponsors. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It's their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric local programming and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that is vital to excellence in the boardroom. Today, we're highlighting a very special sponsor, Foley and Lardner, who has contributed to support our mission of excellent corporate governance. Thank you so much for your support. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Micho Spring. Micho is a senior reputation strategist and crisis counselor. She's an experienced public company director and Boston business and civic leader. Now let me turn it over to Micho.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm delighted to be here today. As our world becomes more fractured yet intertwined, corporations are increasingly being pulled into both political and social issues by key stakeholders. And as we've seen recently, it's not only corporations, but certainly particularly a new generation of employees expect companies to channel their values. With the upcoming elections, we anticipate that the focus on the intensity on these issues will only increase, and companies and boards will need to think about whether and when and how to respond. The views of a company's key constituents may well be in conflict both with each other and at cross purposes with the mission of the company. Reputations are made or lost on how a company navigates these tensions and how it manages the undertow. So what role should directors play both in these discussions and decisions? To discuss this very timely topic, we have with us today a great panel. Let me introduce them. First, Diane Hessen is an award-winning entrepreneur and innovator, a seasoned board director, and a nationally recognized expert on the American voter. She is the founder and chairman of C-Space and now runs Salient Ventures. Her corporate boards include Panera Brands, Eastern Bank, Bright Cove, and Sago. Steve Barth has been advising public company boards of directors on corporate governance and fiduciary duty for 41 years. He's a senior partner at Foley and Lardner. Michael Pryor is the executive chairman of ATN International, where he was CEO for 18 years and previously worked as a corporate lawyer and as an investment banker. So let me start with a question for all three of you. Should companies be taking positions on societal issues at a time when silence is often portrayed as taking a side? And if so, when? Let me start with you, Steve.
Well, thanks, Micho, and it's great to be here with you this morning. So I ascribe to the Mark Twain theory that better to remain silent and be thought a fool than open it and confirm all doubt. I think silence goes away quickly. Words do not. So that is my view and the advice that I typically provide to boards who ask the same question that you did, Micho.
Diane.
Well, I'll answer as a non-lawyer.
I think, Micho, your question is so important because at critical times, your silence sometimes sends the loudest message. People are interested in what companies are saying. So I believe, yes, we should take positions. I mean, sometimes it's easy. So in the aftermath of what happened of George Floyd's murder, companies spoke out about Black Lives Matter, or companies have almost universally taken positions on Me Too. So figuring out what and when is complicated, and there's no one size fits all approach because so much depends on a company and its business and its values and so on. Just really quickly, I think companies need a policy about whether and when to speak up. Somebody taught me one, and I can't remember who to give credit for, but there are like 3 questions you should ask. Does this align with our purpose and core values? In other words, is there reputational risk to speaking or not speaking? Can we meaningfully influence the issue if we speak out? And does this directly impact our shareholders? And what I learned is if the answer to all 3 is yes, you take the lead. If it's 2 out of the 3, you speak up. If it's 1 out of the 3, you monitor it. But being prepared for, and being open and transparent about why you're speaking out also matters. So I think in 2024 and everything going on in the world, silence is sometimes much too loud for organizations to deal with.
Michael?
Yeah, I think it's in between. I like the way Diane framed it, but and my instinct is very much along Steve's line. When in doubt, don't say anything. It's hard because once you do say something on one issue, someone who cares passionately about the next issue is going to want you to speak about that issue.
Yep.
So I think you have to navigate it very carefully, and I think you would look at the first thing I would look at is the employees, right? So the employees, is this really important to the employees that you say something? And again, even there, if you weigh in on one issue, if you're quiet on the next issue,
Exactly.
then they're going to say, why are you quiet? So if you have a policy of being quiet, I tend to agree with Steve. A little easier to maintain it. But I also think there's certain companies, there's certain issues, retail brand, very retail focused brands that have some sort of, sort of the whole brand image is connected to an issue. I don't think you can avoid it. So I do think executives and boards have to be ready for how they're going to weigh speaking or not speaking on specific issues.
And let me ask a follow-up to that, which is also, it's the timing, right? So what gets you, once you've decided either to speak or not to speak, what gets you to change that position? Because it seems to me that that's the most perilous, when you actually have taken a position and then are pressured to change. So talk a little bit, any of you, on the dynamics of what would make you actually change.
You hope not to. that
For
is
sure.
a worst case scenario where you speak and now you feel compelled to speak again about it and change what you've said before. But again, I think it would really depend on the issue. Again, if it's something very closely associated with your company, then you're probably going to have to make corrections and amendments occasionally. Otherwise, if you stay out of it, obviously you never enter into that problem.
So waffling is the worst thing you can do, right? If you're changing your message, then you didn't do the right thing up front. So if you don't follow the silence is golden and you decide you need to speak, you better really game plan and have an echo chamber that's, broad-based, so that you're going to take a position. It's consistent, it's clear, it's concise, and it's not going to waver. And you better be ready for the pushback and how you're going to respond. And have a game plan for it. Again, that's why I'm strongly in the camp of making the calculus. If you speak, 50% won't like you and may take their business elsewhere. The other 50% will say, well, of course they should have said that. but they won't change their buying habits. So that calculus doesn't work well for most companies.
Yeah, I'm not, well, when I say I think companies should speak, I don't think it means they should say, boy, we're really, really disappointed in the results of the election, right? I mean, I think what you say can be neutral, or what you can say can be more theoretical. So for instance, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, lots of companies spoke out when there was a lot of turmoil about whether there was election fraud. This is literally in early November of 2020. I mean, Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan was the first person to speak out. The head of Goldman Sachs spoke out the same day. And what they basically said is, there are strong opinions everywhere. There's tremendous passion here. And it's the responsibility of each of us to respect the democratic process and ultimately the outcome. Let's see what happens. I don't think that's super controversial, right? I mean, you could say, gee, that's cowardly. Maybe he should have taken a stronger stand or whatever. But I think there are lots of things that companies can say that, bring things, make things a little bit calmer or whatever else. And it also depends on whether it's your industry. I mean, in the midst of a vaccine controversy, if you're a pharmaceutical company, people expect you to speak out. If there's something going on in the sports world and you're Nike, they expect you to speak out. So some of it relates to, whether it's relevant to your business, but there are plenty of messages that we can give that are not outrageously controversial.
So let me go back again, another follow-up, and then, and back to Steve. Who should be involved, or should the board be involved, and how, in deciding to speak or not to speak? Since, as you're saying, it could cost the company 50% of its customers, right?
Right. And it's clearly a board decision, right? The CEO and management shouldn't be making those decisions without buy-in from the board. I think there should be more buy-in from that, right? I mean, this needs to be a broad management, evaluation that involves, HR and legal and sales and IR and PR and community relations, government. I mean, it's a broad group to have weigh in and to provide their advice and guidance to the board. But at the end of the day, it's the board that should, direct the policies and whether to stay silent or not of the company. I think Michael's point was great. Once you speak, where do you stop? And I think that is something that you need to put into that equation as you're thinking about, well, why is this topic different than, saving the turtles in the rainforest?
So do you all agree that the board needs to be involved up front?
I think what the board needs is, for those of you who are on compensation committees, there's a thing that you create called a CD&A, a compensation discussion analysis, which is a statement that, all boards have, certainly if they're public, that lays out a company's philosophy about compensation and how it's structured and how it's paid out. And I think that rather than being in a response mode when there's an issue that comes out, I think a board needs to have for societal issues the same thing they have for compensation, which just says, let's anticipate that there could be a situation in which we want to speak out. What are the guidelines that we need to create? What's our philosophy about speaking out? Maybe our philosophy about speaking out is we are always silent. We are always silent. And if there is anything else, then the CEO needs to call the board. But it may be different from that. And I think it's got to get created. It probably starts with NomGov proposing it to the board, but there's so many issues these days. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, corporations are more trusted than most of our other institutions, and people are interested in what companies think. So no matter what, whether you speak or not, I think a board needs to look at it proactively before issues arise.
Michael?
I agree. Yeah, I agree with Diane's point. I think you want to have a basic policy and rules of the road, whether it's, we do speak on these issues. Here's who speaks, here's the process to get approval of what you're going to say, or we don't speak. And if the management thinks we need to speak or someone on the board speak, here's the process to raise it, right? Maybe that seems obvious, but I would do that. And I do think that when you do speak, it should be led by, as I think Steve was implying, by the executive team saying, here, we've looked at this from several angles. Here's what we propose to say, and give the board time to react, or a committee of the board.
So let's step back, because of course it's pretty clear what issues we're going to be called on to speak or not to speak in the coming months, given the way that the election is shaping up. So maybe we want to take a couple of steps back and let Diane frame what are the voters thinking from all your work and research, and give us a little bit of the attitudinal context in which boards are going to have to be making these decisions.
Sure. Let me try to net this out. So if you've read my book, I was in conversation with 500 American voters every week for about 4.5 years. And most of what I found during that time period, which ended about 2 years ago, still holds true today. So I still am in touch with a lot of these voters. I mean, a lot of it is not surprising to all of you. There's anxiety about the election. People are unhappy with choices. But having said that, I think there are a few things that are important as board members to know. Number one, in our country, there is, at least when it comes to policy, much more common ground than you would think in the US. So if you ask most voters about the issues, immigration, gun control, healthcare, infrastructure, even abortion, and so on, you can get over 3/4 of Americans to be willing to compromise on a particular solution. But the perception is that we have all this division because the extremes get the airtime. So we have perceptions of the other side that are really inaccurate. The perception that Republicans have of Democrats is mostly the most progressive 5 to 10%. The perception that Democrats have about Republicans is usually, again, kind of far right, et cetera. The main thing that's going on in terms of this election is the notion of voting against versus voting for. Most Americans in this election will be voting not for someone, but against the other guy. I think that's important to remember. So I'll give you an example. I went out to all of my voters about 2 weeks ago and asked them who they were voting for, and they told me. And then I said, give me an adjective to describe give me one adjective to describe Donald Trump. Give me one adjective to actually describe Joe Biden. And the words are unbelievable. So here are words that Trump supporters use to describe Trump. These are people who are voting for Trump. Ignorant, arrogant, bully, chaotic, narcissistic, immoral, bombastic, charlatan, loud. These are the voices of most Trump supporters. Words used by Biden supporters to describe him: feeble, old, frail, grandfatherly, milquetoast. Now, clearly there are some other positives, but think about this as most people actually voting against. In terms of the issues that are important people, the biggest issues for Republicans are immigration, the economy, foreign affairs, voter integrity. The biggest issues for Democrats are the economy, the Supreme Court, abortion, foreign threats. And I'm happy to answer some more questions about this, but let me just end by saying, what can we expect for November? You asked me, Joe. It's way too early to tell, but I think the person who will win is the one that people think is the least awful, which is a sad state of affairs. The trickiest part here, I think, for November and for boards is this is not about what happens on election day. The big question to me is less who is going to win and more what happens after the election. So for instance, we all know this, but I think it's important for us to think about from a planning point of view. If Biden wins, the Trump factor is very unpredictable, but in all probability, if Biden wins, Trump will again scream that the election was rigged and won't accept the results. And what comes next is going to could be a defining moment in American politics for decades to come, but it could go on for a while. And the reaction of people if Trump wins and what he decides to do right away, and who will lose their jobs or who will be in key seats. So this is not, what do we say about the election, which I think, Steve and Michael, I agree with you. You don't say anything the day after the election, like, gee, it looks like my good guy won or whatever. But I think in the month of November, it's really important for boards to be in touch, depending on actually whether there's a lot of turmoil going on in the country.
Thank you. That was incredibly helpful. But you have listed a set of issues that you're polling on, that the world is looking at, or the political world is looking at, that are going to intensify, and where there's going to be very serious rhetoric in the next few months. It seems to me that that is the set of issues. If you go through them, I guess I would go back, Mike, to you. What are the implications? And a lot of those issues, again, I don't think anybody would advise any company to take a position on partisan politics, but where there are values a company is committed to, some of these issues will certainly rise to the level of threatening those values. So what do you think the implications are as the heat gets turned up around immigration, reproductive rights, the voting rights, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think those issues are hot to begin with. They come and they go in terms of the level of intensity, but they're, the people, I don't know whether, Diane would know much better. By the way, I could listen to her analysis for quite a while and take a break from this. But I think I think you just have to be really careful on those issues. The one issue I think you could potentially weigh in on is, I think somebody said it before, I think it was Diane, but if we have a bad situation and it's really troubled after the election, I think you can acknowledge this is troubled times, but move on. But I just think when, sitting there in the CEO seat, as I was for years, a certain percent, I mean, like it or not, our knee-jerk reaction, because really I think of the way things are portrayed from both sides of the media, is identity politics, right? So if you say something, if I say something, let's say, right, they'll say, oh, CEO, I know which way he leans, right? Okay, older white male CEO, okay. And that's not maybe a majority of the people, but there's a percent of employees and customers. But I'm from Massachusetts. Oh, wait, I know where he leans. Okay. So people would be looking to ascribe motives to you. So I think you have to be very, very careful what you say, because people are going to try to read into it to figure out what side you're really on.
So, Steve, given all this, how do boards make sure the CEO is prepared? What questions to be asking in the next board meeting, since time is of the essence here?
So it's a great question. And I think Diane and Michael set this up really well. But my question that I would always ask of a board and a CEO, asking the question that you did, is how does it relate to the business? How is it going to make the business and the enterprise value of your company better? You've got to be able to answer that question, and compellingly so, right? If you're on the fence saying, well, it's half and half, and gee whiz, our employees really think we should do this, but our shareholders won't like it, and our analysts don't feel the same way, and our customers are half and half, well, then I think the answer is pretty easy, right? I mean, that goes back to my original equation. If there are circumstances where you do find it compelling, that you do feel it is in the best interest of your business and your shareholders and other constituencies, different topic there, but then I think you do have to be very prepared. And you have to do the type of game planning that we talked about before, from a management perspective, to advise your board, where do we stand as a management team? Why do we think this is in the best interests of our business? What is our message going to be? How is it going to be consistent with our culture and our principles? And how are we going to make it concise? How are we going to deliver it? Who is going to deliver it? And what do we do when we have pushback? And you will likely have pushback. Okay, how are you going to react? You need to game plan that just like you would any other crisis, response type of situation. And, have your game plan in place and maybe even do a type of a tabletop exercise on it to talk it through and to be ready for those situations. What you can't do, and what we said before, is change your mind and start waffling and react to pressure and then change your message.
So Diane, does that
That's
mean
good.
that we should all make sure that the agenda of the next corporate board meeting we go to includes a contingency planning for the election, and that the CEO comes prepared to present policy and how we might react to the 5 top issues that are being discussed between now and November?
I would definitely do it. I'd do it even if there wasn't an election coming up. I just think that we are facing a myriad of issues right now as a society, and staying silent is a very, very tricky issue to implement, no less all of those issues. And I know you want to get into this about whether it's the CEO speaking not on behalf of the board or whatever else. The one thing that I would really recommend, though, and remind everybody of is, if you're a company and you're dealing with these issues, you are not alone. All of our companies are dealing with this issue. And one thing I'd really encourage, and I've done this with some of the CEOs that I'm on boards with, is to reach out to other CEOs. And board members can do this with other board members and just say, what's going on? What are you thinking about, et cetera. So a friend of mine who's a professor at Yale School of Management, Jeff Sonnenfeld, he's got a group called the CEO Leadership Institute. He's in touch with, 200-300 CEOs all the time. And, as issues have cropped up over the years, I remember when there were claims of election fraud, Jeff basically reached out to all the CEOs and they got on a Zoom. There were like 90 CEOs on a Zoom, confidential, and everyone talked about what they were thinking and what was going on. And they analyzed statements that had already been made. And, you can kind of say, here's what I'm thinking. You can get to the point where at the end of a really good call like that, if you have 50 CEOs saying, we're all going to say this within the next several days, and this looks like an important but relatively neutral statement, or I ran this by our attorneys or whatever. You can work with other companies. You don't have to say, gee, this is just us and it's cheating to check with someone else. So the collective voice matters on these issues. And I think that CEOs need to learn to pick up the phone and call peers both within and out of their industries.
So let's switch it a little bit to what happens inside the company. So companies care about freedom of speech, but what are the legal guardrails? Can a company prohibit political conversations in the workplace? Because that is also going to be, an issue, I think, between now and the election as it heats up. What are the legal, Steve, let me go to you. What are the legal guardrails when people are thinking about freedom of speech and their ability to say whatever they want to say or to join demonstrations or whatever?
Yeah, and they have every right to do that, to speak, to act, to, in whatever their personal capacity is, to express their own views without restriction by the company. And I think that needs to be made very clear. I think a reminder is that you speak on your own behalf. Look, Kathy did this when we first started the program, right? These are our personal views and not those of our organizations. It would be nice if people did that. They don't really. And that's probably more important when it comes from a CEO or a board member. But nonetheless, they're personal views and they should be, fully free to express those in whatever, form and format they want.
Inside the workplace as well as outside?
You bet. Absolutely.
Which would be interesting. In the old days, we could gather employees in a cafeteria and have conversations and listen to both sides. But what do you think, Michael, that does, how does that work with remote work?
I think that's a negative aspect of remote work, because I think if you think about what Diane discovered in her, following those 500 people, that you get into a workplace, it's a little less tribal than outside the workplace, where we tend to, and I think that has an evening aspect, a leavening aspect, because it puts people together who might, feel like they come from a different angle on issues, and people learn how to moderate discussion for the most part. I think they learn from colleagues, but I don't think you're going to get that, on Zoom or Teams, right? Those sort of spontaneous break room type discussions, morning coffee. I think we're missing. I think, people certainly have every right to do that. I've always found that the more people someone manages, they're a little more cautious about expressing political views, rightly so, I think, right? Because
Yes.
that's sort of a respect for the fact that, you don't want to be seen to be, first of all, wielding your authority on a non-work issue, because you don't have any authority, right? Any more than anybody else. So anyway, I think, hopefully I answered both your questions. I think that,
Yep.
I think in the remote thing, we're missing something, which is probably was, positive for society. Luckily, a lot of people still are in a workplace.
Although if you really think about what we have just lived through in the last few years, first there was George Floyd, who companies had to handle the conversations on Zoom. And there were a lot of town meetings that were incredibly emotional, where people spoke on all sides about their personal experiences and then took it to social media. And then we went through the pandemic, which again got, particularly at some point, put through the political prism of for against vaccines, for against testing, for against calling people back to work. So what, Diane, what have we learned from all that we can take into this? In a way, we've had harder issues or more intense issues, because they affected people so personally and so emotionally already. So what have we learned from all that can be applied to this?
Yeah. I just, again, I think it depends on the company. Michael Jordan once said he was going to stay out of politics because Republicans buy sneakers too. It's difficult to do these days. Actually, sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's easy. I will say I'm on the board of Eastern Bank, and Bob Rivers has been very outspoken about a lot of his issues. And one time he was called on something that he said about LGBT rights. And ultimately, it ended up in a Boston Magazine article where he did kind of a true confessions thing and talked about how he was married. He had a previous marriage, and his wife came out as a gay woman, and how that affected his view of the world and everything. And, I think you could be someone who is completely against gay marriage, look at that thing and say, oh my gosh, this guy's being completely open and authentic. And he didn't run that by the board. And I don't think anybody on the board said, gee, you shouldn't tell your life story there. So context matters a lot. Who are you as an organization, and what do you stand for? I think whether it's remote or not, people in companies need to be treated with dignity. And they also need to know that if they have a view on any of these issues that is different, like dramatically different from their boss or from the CEO, that their job will not be at risk. I mean, when I was a CEO, I was not running a public company. I was running a privately held company, but we had 1,000 employees, and they were all different kinds of views. And I know that I was fairly open about my support of certain candidates and all of that, but I did. I remember once bringing Deval Patrick to my office, and we were walking the hallways, and I said to him, by the way, there are some people in this company who don't like you. And you'll be able to tell who they are, because they're the people who are going to not walk up to you and want to shake your hand. And of course, he had such a great way about him. So he'd walk up to people who were ignoring him and say, hi, I know you don't like me, and Diane tells me that, that doesn't affect your employment, or. So I think you have to create, you don't want to create controversy. Being respectful and treating people with dignity matters because you never know their story. You never know the story that brought them to the point where they are. And I think the more that you can be open and transparent and sometimes forceful about that, the better. And then in terms of messaging, I think we need to have certain core values of the company that always stand there. So saying that these are tricky issues, saying that there's lots of passion and we need to see what's going on. I think there are plenty of things that companies can say as they speak up that don't result in them losing employees and losing customers.
Michael, one of the things that has changed, I think, and I'd love your views on this, is that CEOs 10 years ago expected to make decisions that were 80-20, 80% favorable, 20% unfavorable. Then it kind of, that line has moved, and now you're lucky if you're making a decision that's 51-49, right? And living with that, again, what I call the undertow, managing kind of the undertow becomes crucial. How important is it for CEOs in this and politically divided environment where they're not going to get public support to have 100% board support as they make these decisions?
Well, I think I think you certainly want consensus board support, right? I think even boards, if you have a varied board and you've managed to get a little bit more diversity of viewpoints and things, you might not have 100% of your board feel the same way about it. But I think it's important to try to hash out a consensus behind it. If you're going to take a position on these things, even if it seems uncontroversial, everybody agrees, you still, I think you need that and want that.
No, and then thank you for that. And Steve, just before I'm going to go to chat, Ellen, to see if there's anything that we should be mindful of in a minute. But Steve, are there issues over the last couple of years that you think are easy to say companies should not take a position on? Give us a couple that you would say easy to say stay away from. Is it foreign policy? Is it not easy?
It's not in the script. You can't ask me that.
I know I'm freelancing a little bit. But
You should ask Michael and Diane
it's
that
fun.
question. It's
It's
a great
fun.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I'm gonna do the best debate pivot that I can here and say, I think once you start talking on issues, and Michael may have raised this before, but Diane may have too, is that where do you stop, right? So if there are easy issues, okay, well, that's easy on the easy issues, but then it scrolls to, well, that's not really easy, but it's pretty easy, so we'll still talk. Oh, now it goes to the next phase, and the next phase, and the next phase, and where do you draw the line? Having a really bright black and white line makes, I think, for a much simpler focus on the business and not on, I don't think businesses should be in the business of commenting on political issues, social issues that to the extent they're related to the business, fine. But those are tough decisions. And are you really spending your highest and best uses on commenting on those issues when you should be focused on the business? You better be performing darn well, right? You better be making your numbers and having a great stock price before you're messing around commenting on extracurriculars, in my view. Otherwise, I think you as a board and a management team are ripe for criticism, fair criticism, that you're not focused on the business. So I don't know. In most of my experiences, there's 120% dedication by boards and management team to business issues. And it's hard to squeeze in those that are political in nature or extracurricular societal in nature.
And
Great
Micho,
answer.
yeah, and Micho, I'd add something onto that I think we're, getting close to, but not really talking about. I think as a leader, as a CEO, you have to be very careful about losing your authority. So when you start speaking, you want people to recognize your authority and follow you, your leadership in the business world, when whatever your company does. And if you start coming outside what the company does, you risk for at least some of your employees losing that authority, eroding that authority, and And, and that's just a pragmatic consideration. Now, again, I think Diane's right always to say there's facts and circumstances. There are lots of companies that are almost associated with the leadership, and that is almost the brand. And then that's just part and parcel of it. But I think for a lot of companies, you have to be very careful with that.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Ellen, do we have anything
We
to
do,
report
we
from
do.
the chat?
Okay, we do. Well, we've touched on a lot of the questions, so let me pick up on two. So I'm going to give you two questions. One early on, which was social issues versus politics. Do you simply say, look, we'll talk about social issues that relate to our mission, but absolutely under no circumstance talk about politics? Question one. Question two relates to strategy. This one is interesting because it says, okay, we've been talking about the employees a lot and their concerns, but customers and competitors, stakeholders are going to compare us to other people, other companies. And if our competitors don't speak, is that a different kind of message? And therefore is the proliferation, and related to that is the proliferation of social media really come back to the point that Steve made, which is despite the fact we may be compared to our competitors, is being cautious really the right approach? These both questions are related, but
Well, let's tackle the first one. Is it in today's environment, can you really draw a distinction between social issues and political issues when even the peaceful transfer of power seems to be now politicized?
Right.
So let me throw that out to any of the three of you. Do you think you can really, it'd be great to have that barrier, but is that realistic?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we don't know what political is anymore. You used to say, don't talk religion and politics, but now everything's religion and politics. So I think it's the same issue. Again, Steve, you talked about extracurricular, and I totally agree with you here. If something really is extracurricular, you just say, look, sometimes we make comments on issues and sometimes we don't. We do them when they're very relevant to our business or whatever. But sometimes you're right in there. And especially if you're on the board of a very visible, Fortune 100 type company, it's different. The expectations are different. So, I look at Ken Frazier, who's the CEO of Merck. And so first of all, he's CEO of a prominent pharmaceutical company. And if you're a pharma company and we have all kinds of issues around vaccines and you say nothing, that just seems like you're not doing your job. And yet, he was on an advisory council, a business advisory council for Trump. And in the aftermath of the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and when Trump was talking about violence on many sides, which seems like it happened forever ago, Ken Frazier was the first CEO to resign from the council in response. So what do? I mean, he didn't resign loudly. He just said, I'm not comfortable being in this particular situation. I think a lot of issues are like that. You're already involved. You're already advising. This is something that's actually related to our business. And I think under those circumstances, you're kind of stuck. You can't just say, I mean, if he stayed on that council versus not staying, either move would have been controversial.
But just a note on that, because I remember reading it very carefully. When he resigned, he said, on a personal level and as chairman of Merck or CEO of Merck, whatever he was at the time, I cannot stay here, which led me to think he called home and checked with his company before he did that, which I thought was interesting, right? I mean, he did it on both counts, which must have been a very intense discussion all around. But anyway, any other thoughts on that, Steve or Michael?
I mean, I agree with Dan. I think there are a few still pure, social issues. I would argue that in the first instance, when it occurred, the George Floyd situation was social. It became very political, like everything else, in terms of the reaction and the aftermath, and what do we do about it? How do we characterize it? How do we view it? But in the initial instance, I think it was more social. I think, an outbreak of foreign conflict, somehow involving the US in the first instance is not really a political issue. It's a thing that everybody typically will, be on the side. Then it will quickly get politicized, right? So I think over time, pretty much what Diane said is true. The line blurs, but in the beginning, it's different. And then, there are issues like government spending on certain programs that may impact your business. There's taxes and how that's treated that I think also could impact, could be sort of more purely political.
We want to tackle the second question, and as I summarized it, Ellen, and interrupt if I didn't get it right, but we're really talking about whether it's strategic to focus too much on employees, right? Whether you have to be careful that you're not leaving others behind. Comments on that?
So it does raise the question that I think is fair for every board to have, periodically is, what is your view as a board of your relevant constituencies, and how do they, impact your business? How are they going to be come into consideration as your board makes decisions? And I think that is a very healthy discussion for every board to have. Obviously, the views on that are trending over the last 20 years or so, right? And to the old, 1930, views of a corporation as solely profit maximization for the benefit of shareholders to more of a constituency model nowadays. And that's easy to say because mostly you say, well, if it's good for our constituencies, it's good for our shareholders, and we're all one happy family, and that's what matters. But when constituencies come into battle, who wins? And I think that's a good discussion for every board to have, to think about it on a clear, quiet morning, rather than when the storm clouds are looming on a stormy night. So.
Well, particularly, we all watched Disney have to pivot on the legislation in Florida when they had agreed with the government to stay neutral, and then their employees went crazy, right? And so and also the conflict between, depending where your headquarters are, between the, we all serve with companies that have headquarters in very different political worlds. And not headquarters, but presence. And so how do you weigh all that? Michael, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, we live that. That's tricky, right? Because we're all over the place, including outside the US, and we're certainly in different, political spots in the US. I think you have to respect your employees and your customers, and you have to, and a lot of companies, certainly our company, you have to have try to maintain a good and even relationship with the governments. So, I saw a question actually from one of my board members about, what do you do if you have large government contracts, right? So I'm just to touch on that briefly, I think you have to, that goes to what Steve was just saying. You have to weigh that. You have to consider that and be careful how you deal with that, in terms of taking positions, because it does matter there in these days, and whether it's in a state government or in the federal government, there's an awareness there. And if you're seen to be too far on one side, it can hurt you.
Well, we saw that. I don't know if you remember Wayfair, but they had a contract, fulfilling, I think, sending beds to the immigration camps on the border, and their employees had a big rebellion against that,
Mhm.
which was an interesting case study, which finally calmed down. But yeah, you can, it's tricky. But Diane, do you have anything to say about that issue?
I mean, look, I think that we need to have the conversation in our organization, you know, for our company, what does it mean to be good colleagues to each other? You know, it's funny, at Panera, which literally has 2 headquarters, there's one in Boston and one in St. Louis. So it starts with baseball teams, you know, who are
Who
literally,
wins in
who
that
are
situation?
literally
Yeah.
have been playing each other in the World Series. And there, it's easy, right? You can scream and yell that the other team's awful. And, you know, because in sports, I guess it's okay. So I think having those conversations that say, what do we want for our culture here? And how are we going to treat each other? And what should we do when one of our coworkers says something that we think is offensive or whatever? Do we just say, you know, you're a jerk and walk away? Or do you engage with that person? I mean, I think you need rules of the road. And I think you need leaders who understand how to deal with those situations. But, you know, they're all addressable. There are plenty of companies that have worked through how to handle employees who have wildly different points of view. And, you know, I think the more that people can engage with each other, the better. As you know, I'm a big believer in that.
As long as they don't criticize the Celtics, right?
As long as they don't criticize the Celtics. Yeah, I mean, you can do that. But, you know, somebody's saying something. This is going to sound like a Pollyanna because there's a lot more to it. But if one of your coworkers says something that you think, you know, they believe something that you don't believe, say, that's, you know, I'm really struck by what you just said. Tell me more. Where does that come from? Right? Why do you feel that way? Oh, really? Well, what about this? What about this? What about this? I mean, just trying to understand the other person's point of view makes an enormous difference. And you can create that kind of culture.
Well, and it's
obviously
interesting
easier
because
to do if you have a smaller company.
it's interesting because there's a lot of data out there showing that employees nationally believe that there's more civility at the workplace than in their communities. And that's
Yes.
certainly a shift from where we all grew up, I suspect. But anyway, so let me ask a different question. Should companies be actively encouraging citizenship, specifically giving employees information and time to register and vote? Let's start with you, Steve.
Well, my view is that businesses are in the business to be in business, not in the business to, you know, promote or focus on civic issues unless it's directly related to the business. So my view is no. And your question about providing information, well, what information? Whose information? It's naturally going to be skewed one way or the other and create controversy and distraction from the business. So, you know, my view is individuals have their own personal civic responsibilities that does involve a time commitment personally. And that should be outside of what you have to do for business. But that's my personal view.
You know, when you asked that, Micho, my first reaction is like, okay, what can be controversial about encouraging people to vote? It's like giving blood, right? It's fine. But 5 seconds later, I'm thinking, no, that's not how it will be received. It will be, Steve's right. It will be received as for one side or the other, depending on where you're trying to get out the vote, at least potentially. And so that's pretty unfortunate because I think that should not be a controversial issue.
So it should not be, I mean, a lot of companies did start giving time off for people to vote. You don't think that that's going to be?
No, I think that's different. I think you can absolutely make it easy and make sure the workplace is supporting people want to go out and vote. I think that's a little different from, you know, educating people and saying, here, you got to vote, please get out to vote, right? Doing the get out the vote work, I think will be seen as political, but making accommodations for people to vote, I think absolutely.
Diane?
Well, again, that depends on the company. I mean, I think if you have a company where people are basically working 9 to 5 or, you know, where there's a lot of flexibility, people have control over their time, making a big deal over voting is, you know, it's a bit inauthentic to me, right? I mean, you can say, I hope everybody votes tomorrow, but it's not like you have to do anything to give people a chance to just go out and vote. Whereas if you're in a business where you've got employees that are actually required to be working during certain business hours, and you start doing the math and you feel that it's actually going to be challenging for them to vote, that's a more important business decision. And I think it's great. I think it's great for companies to be able to do that. But again, I think it's all about context.
But with early voting, is this really even an issue? Right? I mean, everybody can mail in votes. They can vote early. They have a whole month to vote almost. Really? I mean, it may
Well,
be
it's
more
not
of an
every
issue when
state.
you had to go on a Tuesday and
Yeah.
you between 7 and 8 and you're working 12 hours. Maybe, I can understand it, but nowadays, really? I don't know.
Well, it's
A lot of
different by
people might
different
not
states.
vote early. They might be hoping
Well,
against
okay,
hope that there's
so
another choice.
why not give blood too, right? You should give time off for that.
Right.
That's a good thing to do, right? Everybody needs it. We should have time off for that. Why not?
I
Where do
think
you
one of the other issues, this is a variation on Micho's question, but now there are a whole bunch of employee resource groups at companies. I mean, there are the gay employees, the Black employees, the Muslim employees, et cetera. How would, especially Stephen Michael, do you feel, what if there is an employee resource group that comes up that's pro-life employees? What do you
Steve,
think
you like
about
the
that? Is
tough
that like,
questions.
can employees form their own groups? And do you do anything about that?
Oh, well, I think this is, the same question about do people have individual rights to express their viewpoints? And I think if you're going to do it as a group of individuals, that's fine. Should it be sponsored by the company? Should you have
Should you fund it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably crossing the line, but that's a tougher call, right? I'd have to think more on that. Again, personal versus business sponsored, I think there should be a distinction there. Again, probably the lines are tough to draw.
Yeah, I
Any
think,
policies, go ahead,
sorry.
go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think the college campuses faced this years ago. I mean, they went fairly consistently in one direction. But if you the first step could be, okay, will we provide? Can you use some company facilities to rally people or to hold an informational session? To and all the way to funding is Steve, and I do think you've got to be careful there because it's no different than taking a position on another issue. You absolutely shouldn't and can't discourage employees from talking to each other about political issues and forming groups, and that they should certainly be able to do that.
How about board policy? Is there any policy about individual board members endorsing candidates, et cetera, et cetera? Should boards be in any way guiding board members to the potential of causing controversy?
Yeah, you wouldn't have any more board members if you did that, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So I think it's in the same realm of individuals have their individual rights to, express their political or social views as they seem fit. And I think you do need to be a bit careful there to make sure that board members and senior management aren't speaking on behalf of their companies. But I think in most cases they do that. So,
Ellen, do we have anything from the chat to report before I go forward?
There's
We
a
can't hear
new
you.
one that I'm just now reading, which is kind of interesting, which says, perhaps you can look to the company core values if diversity is part of the core values and supporting diversity, ergo, could be aligned. If pro-life is not part of the company core values, then no justification to support. So you might want to delve into that a little more. Having said that, people are really appreciating the diversity of the viewpoints.
Yeah. I really like that comment about core values. I think that's, I don't know who made that, but look, one of the ones that I remember that touch on this is, when Colin Kaepernick was banned from the NFL, Nike came out with this ad campaign that said, believe in something. Like, even if it means sacrificing everything, just do it. And they got enormous props from doing that. Now, number one, I think how they did that and how they said that, which is, let's just support someone who believes something so strongly that they're willing to give everything up for it. But it was also so consistent with their brand and who they are, which is a brand that does speak out and does take controversial positions and that really, really understands their core customers. So I do think this is a conversation that starts at the board level that says, who are we? Who are we as a company? And what is our responsibility to our stakeholders? And is one of our stakeholders, our community and our society? And sometimes the answer to that will be yes.
Comments on that?
Well, I think Diane's pointed out a number of times, right? You really have to take the facts and circumstances. So Nike, that, I'm sure there was legitimate, good, strong feeling about it, but I bet it was also calculated that this is a very, maybe it's a risk, but it's a good risk to take, consistent with their brand, et cetera. So that's a special circumstance, I think. I do think that question is a good question because it's a tricky question, right? If you're for diversity in the workplace, well, why are you not saying it out loud about diversity elsewhere and how you support these other efforts? I still come down the way I started, and along the lines of Steve, because I just think it's hard once you take official positions on things, not weighing in on a lot of things, but you certainly shouldn't need to be quiet about what your values are in the workplace and for the company itself and how it goes about its business.
Well, let's make it specific for a moment, for example, because there are initiatives in a lot of states on the ballot in November on reproductive rights. It's one thing not to comment on reproductive rights when the Supreme Court came down, which many companies opted, rightly so, to just amend their benefits, but not necessarily comment on the decision. But this might be an intensely local issue that will affect many companies. What do you think the at which reverberates through the country? So what do you think the right way to approach reproductive rights would be?
Steve, I think you got that one.
Go, Steve.
You guys.
Take the
I want to
easy
get
one,
paid
Steve.
extra for this thing. Yeah, so I think what you're saying is, look, if your company is going to extend your benefit plans to cover it, are you actually speaking? Are you taking a position? Is that in essence what you're asking me, Sho?
Yes,
Which is a
yes.
great question. And I don't know the answer to that. I haven't thought about it. I think that somehow
I
is
knew
different.
I would find a question that.
Yeah, I think that is somehow different, although I can't really explain it, than actually speaking out on something. I guess actions are louder than words. But I think to the extent you believe and a board believes that, it's a competitive advantage for your employees to, have that type of a benefit. And if it's important to your employees and that therefore drives the business, then it's within a business judgment of the board to make that decision. And I'm not sure that I'm having a harder time seeing the pushback there. I'm having a harder time seeing the distraction from the business and taking an extraneous or extracurricular point of view there. I think that's a lot more connected to your business. So maybe I'm
Well,
wrong.
especially since employers are responsible for providing health insurance, right?
Right.
So that is the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
No, I think it is. I think I can see the issue. I think it's a really good question because that's a really hard one. I think the tendency of most of us running companies and healthcare plans would be to consider, making that accommodation for the health of the employee, right? And I'm pretty sure most plans support a lot of things that could be controversial, like drugs or morning after pill or things like that anyway. But if you do it, you have to realize that there could be some, a segment of employees or customers or politicians who say, so let's say you're in a state that has very severe restrictions on abortion, you operate in that state, you have a relationship with the government, you have a lot of employees, you will have some employees who say, wait a second, the company's making a special accommodation to fund someone to go outside the state to have an abortion, which they think is morally wrong, right? And, or maybe they're a politician and they don't care about morally, and it's just politically you're end running them. Either way, it could be controversial. And I don't know the answer to that situation, except, I know I don't think my personal position matters, but I think you would need to really consider that. That's probably the board should know about that in that type of situation as you make your decision, whichever way you may go. I do think most companies will tend to try to accommodate the health of their employee, right? But it's not free of risk.
Yeah. Diane, you have anything to add to that?
No, I think those are well said.
So let's go back to preparing for election results. How should companies be prepared for there to be contested election results and therefore civil disorder? Is that one of the contingencies that they should be prepared for? And the reaction among employees, I suppose, in a situation like that.
I think anything that could affect your business is part of your planning around risk, right? So you certainly have to think about this and consider whether it's a risk to any of your operations or your employees, which is really the same as your operations, right? So, yeah, I think you have to consider it and plan for it.
And do you think that, I mean, again, Steve, you were saying that companies need to do a lot of work ahead of that. It's all contingency planning. Where does this belong on the board? Is it the risk committee? Is it, who should be asking whether or not companies are appropriately anticipating all the possible scenarios here, since this is in a way something we should be prepared for, because one of the candidates is announcing that could very well, that accepting election results might not be the thing.
So I think it's a full board issue. I think this is important enough that you need the viewpoints of all of your directors, not just a committee, which could skew results, one way or the other. No idea how it would be. Every board committee structure is, perhaps different than the overall structure of the board. But I think these is one of the key areas that defines kind of the role of the board and the role of the company. And I think that's a full board decision. Again, with input, advice, and direction from the management team, because they have to help guide the risk landscape here. Did they have this discussion at Anheuser-Busch as they decided, their promotions for Bud Light? I mean, as great as Nike was with Colin Kaepernick, the flip side of that was the Anheuser-Busch story, right? So how do you make sure you don't fall into that category? And that's a management call, and they better have really thought through those issues and then brought the board in to the extent it's a board issue. And some of those are not board issues.
Yeah, go a little deeper on who on the management team do you think needs to be in the discussion?
So I think this is a team sport, and it's got to be an echo chamber. And the more input you have, the better. No surprise, any risk management is benefited by more input. But here, you need to have the viewpoint of your IR, your PR, your legal, your HR, your sales, right? What are customers going to say? Your HR from an employee standpoint. What are your government relations folks having to say? How is this going to affect the question about government contracts or our relationships with our local, statewide, federal government? I mean, all of those voices have to be heard and taken into account before the board can, decide on what is our policy going to be and how do we react.
I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that although saying we're not going to take any positions seems like an easy answer, it is incredibly hard, because you've got to go through a lot of preparation in order to know that you can say no and stick with it. And that's an interesting, so it's not, let's just, decide that there's a big wall here. It's that it's got to be a very well-considered decision, as important as if you were taking a position. And that's, I'm not sure that that's well practiced. So
Very well
like-
put, and I would agree, it's not well practiced.
yeah.
Yeah.
Comments from Michael or Diane on that? Who's in the room deciding these things and who should be in the room, Michael? From your,
Go ahead, Diane.
The one, were you going to say something, Michael?
I'll wait. You can go.
Yeah, I think if I got granular about it, I think the board expresses to the CEO that we need to get ahead of this, that we need a policy. I think the CEO has some thoughts on it, meets with the leadership team, definitely what Steve talked about, because there are so many different areas of expertise and responsibility that are important for this. And then they bring that back either to a board committee for in-depth conversation, you know, or generally the board. I'd probably take it to committee first, just because we have limited time at a board meeting. And if you do have a risk management committee, I take it to that committee, or I do think you can take it to NomGov because there are governance issues around that. And then if a committee vets it in depth, then it would go to the whole board.
Michael?
Yeah, that's why I let Diane go first, because that's
Uh.
perfect. She said that much better and more wisely than I could have. I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense.
So let's go to the two takeaways that you would suggest that board members listening to today take back to their respective boards. Let's start with you, Steve.
So I'm going to amend. I had thought about this question in advance and had what I thought was a pretty good answer. But Micho, I think you just raised something that forces me, or not forces me, but encourages me to modify it a bit. And that is, you know, my view was, as you heard up front, is that, you know, silence is golden, you know, much more risk speaking than not. But if you are going to speak, you better really go deep, right? Go deep and go long, and you better really think about and game plan out, you know, what you're going to say, who's going to say it, how your reaction is going to be. But the amendment to that is, and you raised it, Micho, that I hadn't really thought about, is before you take the stay silent position, you should have a pretty detailed discussion of that at your board meeting, informed by your management team or a risk committee, whatever you think. But I think it should be talked about and decided up front what your basic stance should be.
Thank you. Michael?
I'm not sure. I had a little flutter there. So could you?
Oh, the
repeat
two
that again, Misha,
takeaways
'cause I
that,
didn't hear. I've heard most
two-
of Steve's answer.
so two takeaways that you would suggest that board members take
That's-
back to their respective boards. I think we're losing you. Did you hear that?
I didn't.
You didn't hear it.
I
Okay.
want
I
to
just
try
heard the
that
last
trick
part.
next
See,
time.
somebody,
Please.
you know, when he said that he agreed with me, somebody just didn't
Right.
like that. So
That's
they
when we hit the
disconnected him.
button. Right. Uh-huh.
Now can you hear me?
I
Yeah.
can hear you now, but it is fluttering for whatever reason.
Okay, two
I have-
takeaways
Yep.
for people to take to their boards.
From this
Yes,
discussion, I think that the board needs to have a conversation about it, first of all, period. Like what are our guidelines? What's the committee that's going to look at this, to which the CEO should come or should be reaching out? And I think we talked a lot about the election. You might as well anticipate that and, you know, have a clear conversation about that, about whether you're going to take any position at all and under what circumstances.
Diane?
Let's see, let me come up with two different ones. One is, I would say, I think we need to remember that speaking is not the only way to take a stand. So, you know, you can speak out for gun control, or you can donate to Everytown USA. You know, you can, as we just talked about a few minutes ago, you can speak out for women's reproductive rights. It's easier to do that if you're a female CEO, but you can speak out for that, or you can give employees a benefit to pay for their travel if they need to go to another state for an abortion. I mean, there are lots of different tools that we have. And I think immediately thinking maybe speaking always has to be the thing is not the case. you know, having said that, I want to go back to something that Steve implied, which, well, first of all, I think being quiet right now is a really good idea because I personally believe companies are going to have to keep their powder dry for the fall. You know, there may be things happening that we want to speak about, but the big thing here is be a great company. You know, if you are a great company and your customers love your products and your employees love working there, I think you have way more leeway than you think you do.
Yes.
You know, I have this joke, and I want to make sure I want to make sure that I put this in context. I don't tweet this, right? But like, I love Amazon so much that I said to my daughter the other day, if Jeff Bezos were an anti-Semitic pedophile, I'd probably still buy from Amazon because the experience is so magical. Now, that was an extreme thing to say to make the point. Look, plenty of Republicans took their kids to Disney, no matter what Ron DeSantis did, and no matter what Disney said. So I think the point here is if you know your company and its values, it is very important to think this stuff through. And, you know, there are risks to any actions, but I think that most of our companies are not at risk of everything falling apart just by making one statement. So this is about being great for our customers and employees and stakeholders, which kind of gives us the leeway to be able to, you know, speak openly and frankly when really important issues come up.
But, you know, it's interesting. I just saw in the chat, what about Disney? And what about Delta? What about when you're threatened with losing state
Yes.
incentives that are baked into your business model, right? And the decision to really pick employees over those two must have been wrenching,
Yes.
right? In both cases. I mean, Coke with voting rights, same thing.
Yes.
And so it's an interesting set of issues that will not come easy. And I suspect, I mean, they'll get harder as time goes by because all these levers are being used and set. There's a lot of precedent being set for what's, you know, what levers can be used against companies that speak out. So it's going to be an interesting thing. But let me just ask one more question. Any lessons from what we just watched universities go through? There, in a way, you had, you know, the way we've seen employee activism rise over the last 10 years. You had student activism. It really emboldened by social media and probably outside agitators, really produce a whole level of disruption that we had not seen in a long time. Any thoughts of any lessons from companies, since those students are our employees very soon, right? And they seem to bring a whole new level of activism wherever they go. So any thoughts of how, Steve?
I thought that was a great example of changing your message and waffling, right? You know, many of the universities, as we know, took the position of, you know, appeasement and let's let it run its course and that'll be the right thing. And then suddenly all changed their mind. A few, you know, took a different position on that, Florida, for example, and things like that. But that's when it seems to me that the problems really began. Or got much worse. And that was, you know, they tried to take a position feeling that was in, you know, their best interest from a cultural and, you know, principles point of view, but then changed. And then, you know, all heck broke loose, as we saw.
Michael, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I touched on this briefly before. I think there's a lesson in that for companies. It's a very different environment for, you know, a lot of reasons than most companies. So I wouldn't draw the parallel too far, but I do think it just shows you that once you start to take some position, well, then it's not over, right? It's not over, and you've got to game plan it as to where it could go, right? And that is really tricky on a university environment. So I think the biggest lesson I would draw from that from a company standpoint is the sort of unintended consequences and the fact that you can't control once you you know, even if you do nothing, that's doing something, right? But so you have to be prepared for these things to change and modify and the situation to get more difficult.
Diane, so given what you have been talking about in terms of a sense of community, it seems to me that one interesting analogy is that universities seem to not have learned from companies what a multi-stakeholder environment looks like, because in fact, they have stakeholders that have become donors and much more important than they were 10 years ago. And the friction between the right of free speech and the right to have order on the campus became fueled by all these stakeholders. And in a way, companies have gone through the evolution of learning how to deal with multiple stakeholders, and it's still an art, but certainly much more engaged in that model. And universities are much more hierarchical and seem to have gotten themselves into a little bit of more trouble because of lack of that sense of community and equality among stakeholders. What's your thought?
You know, I was a trustee at Tufts for 10 years and just came off, and I will tell you that it is very hard. I mean, the tricky thing about universities is there are so many more stakeholders. I mean, you've got alumni and parents and of all of the stakeholders, the ones that have the most power are the faculty in most universities. But again, getting ahead of these events is critical, and I think we've all, Steve alluded to it with University of Florida, but, Ben Sass wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that he got a lot of credit for. But what he basically said is, here's our philosophy. We will always defend your right to free speech and free assembly. But if you cross the line on things that are clearly prohibited, you're going to be thrown out. And you could be thrown out for 3 years. I think, and not everybody really liked what he said, but he was clear about what their philosophy is. And I think universities have to figure this out now, because any university that's going, boy, we survived that one, is insane. I mean, the fall is going to be tempestuous on university campuses. I mean, students are preparing now. There have been lots of articles about it, but I think universities have to say what are our clear ground rules now, because I think it's going to be crazy. And as you say, Micho, there have always been lots of stakeholders at universities, but they're all way more activist than they ever were. So it's just starting for universities.
Well, and they have to absorb 25% of of a new class, right? Which God knows, what their views are.
What's coming?
Yeah. Watch that. Yeah, exactly. Steve, you were nodding a lot. So do you want to add something?
I thought Diane's view was, and I hadn't thought about what's going to happen this fall, but you're absolutely right. Oh my gosh, I didn't think about that.
It's going to be a wild fall. I mean, Micho, when I look at you and all of your expertise in crisis management, I mean, the people who know a lot about this are going to be very busy in the fourth quarter of this year.
Well, I must say that the corporate world does not have tenured stakeholders, and that is a blessing. That is one advantage we've got over universities, right? Because you're right. The fact that the faculty it's not, their power comes from the fact that they're tenured. So imagine, I mean, I suppose that companies, all of us have had to deal with unions, there's a little bit of that, but tenure is tenure. And that's a whole other layer. But anyway, Ellen, anything that the chat wants to add in our last minute here?
All set.
I think there's one item that is just made that is worth repeating. Oops, it just disappeared, which is once, oh dear. Sorry, guys.
Oh.
I lost it. Once clear on rules, need to enforce them consistently and without bias. I thought that was a very interesting point from the.
Absolutely right.
So leave you with that thought. I think this has been an amazing conversation, everyone.
That's my new takeaway, by the way. That's a good one. Yeah.
That is a good one.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. It's although God knows who could have anticipated the pandemic. God knows what crises are coming in the next 5 years. But yes, that's a really good rule. Kathy, back to you.
Thanks so much. This panel has been incredible. Myself serving on a couple of university boards over time and with my share of corporate boards, the idea that you can't avoid these issues and you have to sit down and talk about them before you're in the middle of them, I think is something that I certainly appreciated before the panel, but I appreciate even more now. And looking at the fall and being on both university boards and corporate boards, I'm thinking, oh my God, so much for summer. This was an unbelievable focus on such a timely topic. So I can't thank you, Steve, Diane, Michael, and especially Micho enough for the effort that went into this program. It was fantastic. I got a couple of other items I need to mention. Our program calendar is filling up, and we hope you will join us at one or more of our upcoming events. I hope they're all as exciting and engaging as this one. On July 11th, we're partnering with the Philadelphia chapter and jointly hosting a virtual fireside chat with SEC Director Eric Girding on climate disclosure issues and rules. On July 17th, we'll be hosting a sequel to our June 5th AI program, which was fabulous, which will be a hands-on in-person event with practical sessions on how AI is being used inside companies. Finally, please visit our website for a complete list of our upcoming events, which are enormous. Finally, don't forget the survey. The link is in the chat and it will be in our follow-up email, which you'll all receive later today. Please take a moment to fill it out now. We really do value your input and we use your comments to shape our programs. Thanks to everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, and have a great day.